start with whichever ARC wants to go first or group about what did you realize listening in the way you did around the top, the way you participated in this process, and what were the key insights from your perspective, from your role that you assumed in this process. After we do that, we're happy to spend a little time answering questions about this process, because I've heard a lot of people asking questions just about the process in general, and then I wanted to do some thank yous and wrap-ups as well, but we're running our time a little late, so we want to make sure we're honoring everybody's schedule as well. Okay? So I'm inviting whichever story arc would like to report out. So tell your arc, maybe even say your name, and then say a few key ideas or insights, okay?
Hello, my name is Mary Gardner Farrell, and our arc was relationships and partnerships. And the way we identified our key themes and patterns was we just went around our table a couple of times and talked about what the story was and what came up around relationships. The two primary themes that came up were the healing power of relationships and how that can happen when you're in an environment that's safe and respectful and there's trust and everyone feels heard. And then the second key theme was that collaborative relationships amongst a purpose-driven group can create meaningful results.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Another arc?
Hi, I'm Gary. This group, we had the pivotal moments and the magic moments. I think really the key learnings that came out of this is understanding how do you build relationships and continuity so that things last. We heard a lot of things that last about 3 years and then they disappear, or other things start, and it takes almost 3 years to get started. 3 years is a magic number, apparently, but it takes time. This is not one thing that you turn the switch and suddenly it gets on. It takes a long time to go on, but the hard part is maintaining it. We also found that people have to look beyond traditional definitions of diversity. Sometimes you look for one type of diversity, you get a different type of diversity. You got to look beyond it. You can't just always get what you expect, and you can't just dismiss it either. It's equally as valid. Safe spaces are really important for people to open up and communicate with each other safely without worrying about being judged or anything. That's it. You got to take time.
Thank you. Thank you. How about another group? Yeah.
My name is Cherie Lockett, and we looked at design and process, and we learned initially that we had to focus our attention on not just the narrative. We had to listen differently than if we were not given a task, so it made us more attentive. So there was a focused listening process. We looked at how the narrative, some of us looked at how the narrative flowed and how that process went, whereas others were looking at the process and at process within the narrative. So there were a couple ways of looking at the process. We learned not to give up, that there was a lot of passion around us, that it not only impacted the groups we worked with, but ourselves. And so that was a very important part, and that affected, we were affected by that change. And that's it.
So anything about the different processes you learned about? About the process that were used in dialogue and deliberation? Did you talk about anything that seemed to
You mean the
stick
more
out?
formal process?
Well, or whatever was used.
I know in my group we talked about appreciative inquiry, World Cafe, so some of those came into play. And so there were some informal processes that were discussed, as well as more of a formal process as the group matured and evolved. So we all noticed that.
Thanks. Okay. Another group? Scott.
Okay, we had that arc about asking questions, and we talked sort of on a meta view about taking a role of listening and how it does set an intention for your purpose of why you're listening, and sometimes that gets in the way. of being truly involved on an emotional level. So there takes some regulation or some self-management. It also is an incentive to really stay in an active listening place. And being willing to miss some parts of the story for playing your role correctly, doing it right. And the themes of the questions will often change from the beginning of the story, the questions that they were asking themselves at the beginning of their story, to what they were gathering at the end. And it's important to notice those shifts. They were not consistent necessarily, no, just there was often a shift. Sometimes it was easier to listen for questions because the person actually served them up on a platter and said, this is what I was questioning. And other times you really had to work at what is the story or the question implicit behind what they're talking about. And a good opportunity for us to build that muscle of asking what's really going on behind the scenes. There was a question about overlap of many of the roles. Are they mutually exclusive? Do some of the roles that we all play overlap? And there were some themes developed that were common themes that were heard around the table, even in different roles. And then in terms of how it might change our own practice, really an invitation to being a better listener with intention and managing the meta skill, meta view of what's going on with the emotional content or the empathetic listening to what's going on in that person's heart at the same time.
Yeah. So my name's Chris Petit, and we had the listeners/hosts for our group. A number of different themes came up. One was the necessity for a safe space, for having honor and trust and safety in that space. Also for having a venue to connect with people in a different way. Let's see what else came up. There was just a need for people to be heard. No matter the age range, if it was children or if it was parents or seniors, there was kind of a general need for people to be heard, and really a sense that people that had personal tragedies didn't want to pause to reflect, and so having a venue where it was safe to share and for people to really be heard being necessary. There was also a theme of tools of different facilitation. Circle and Cafe came up. There was the idea of hurt people, and the idea of self-sabotage and how worthiness and generational suffering can continue. So listening and dialogue being allowing people to break those cycles of generational suffering. And then just general process of opening with a question, having interim dialogue, and then summary came up. Inviting diverse groups of people to come together. And then finally just the need for participatory democracy. So everyone being involved in decision making and how it's important to figure out what a community's needs are versus assuming that you know what those needs may be. Thank you.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything?
This is Melody, and we had the narrative topic, and there was a couple of things that really came out. Our group was really neat in that we actually listened differently. But one of the key things that we came out with was that hearing without judgment, and how empowering and how powerful that was, not only to the speaker but to the listener. And as we talked about it, we talked about how some of us listened with our head and kind of took down the story, not knowing where it was going to go, listened for the events of the story, and others listened with our heart, which was, what were those key events, what was going on with that. So the difference between those two, not only in how we heard the story and somewhat recorded the story, but in how we played it back as well, and how powerful that was not only for the listener, but how we might even take that home and use that within our personal situations as well. So that was one piece of it. Another big part was the context. So thinking about, typically, when you hear a story or when you're reacting to something, you're in the moment. And what you're hearing is the context that you bring to the story. So it's what's happening at that point in time. But the story itself, as we listen to the narrative, we get to hear all of the context. Starting at point A, what were all of the things that essentially led up? What was that thought process? And how did we get actually from point A to where we are today in point B? So again, that context was so important. And I think, anything else? That was it.
I'm Chrissy, and we identified two, and then our computers were running out, so I'm going to add one more that's not to the original. We were listening for challenges and barriers, and the first challenge that we talked about was sustainability. There was a story about budget and just the financial sustainability of an organization, the emotional energy necessary, so balancing family and the not-for-profit initiatives, and then even space, physical space, like not being able to find a home and a place to meet regularly. So sustainability, those three areas. We also talked about connection, from parent-child connections to within a larger nuclear family to and then within the communities as well. There seems to be connection was a barrier and something that kept each of our stories stuck for a while. And then what I heard, and I don't know if you agree with this, we got cut off before we could finish our whole conversation, but it was that the systems that are represented in our stories are broken. The educational system, the prison system, the budgeting systems, and even within families, that those systems are not, they have loopholes and gaps that need to be fixed. Is that right? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. How about over here, our storytellers?
So I'm Kaya, and we talked a lot about what we learned from telling our stories and listening to the story captures. So one of the biggest takeaways was that there was really nothing like being listened to, that we realized how often we're in spaces where we're not listened to, and how we yearn to be listened to as well as yearn to be better listeners. We talked about the ways in which hearing people reflect our stories back to us inspired us about the work that we were doing. How sometimes our own self-talk is all about what we're not doing, what we didn't get to, how we could do it better. And hearing other people reflect back all the positive work that we're doing was really inspiring and reinvigorating.
Wow. So I want to thank you, storytellers. I think, I was struck with this tension about our listening through the story and then our need to analyze the process. There's so many facilitators in the room. I'm like, where am I listening and what am I paying attention to? And that's a little different than sometimes when we use this process in other contexts. It really is. Because the storytellers is exactly what happens, is that you don't usually get listened to at that level of intentionality and real interest in deep care about what I'm really hearing. Am I hearing it right? So it's really an important lesson for all of us. I would like to, I'm a little worried about time because I think we're on our time, but I want to, if we had had a little more time, we would have taken another half hour to kind of start to really digest some of the things we've heard, both from our own, from the story, from our conversation, and start to say, so what does this really mean for us in dialogue and deliberation? What can we really use both in our own practice, and how might we actually grow our community of practice to be more impactful, because it's so needed on so realized that Mary Alice Arthur, who was really one of the prime architects and authors of this process, is going to be at our art of hosting as a guest.
Oh, she is?
Right.
And she's brilliant at this, and she is going to be in the country. She travels the world, and she's not only an amazing storyteller, but she also is a great cross-pollinator. So she's all carrying stories from other places, and she's also an amazing listener. So she starts generating what she's hearing from a story and all the questions, and it's really gets you into another level of understanding the story. So I invite you all to pay attention when we send out our invitation to the art of hosting, which is called Leading Engagement. And it's really about wherever we're seeking to engage people in meaningful conversation, dialogue, deliberation about the decisions that affect them. So how are we really being more inclusive around the ways we're working, whether it's in our job, in our offices, in our staff, whether it's in our communities, in our schools, in our institutions, in our families, but how are we really leading that engagement so we can get to a coherent page of where we can all go and what we can do together that we can't do alone. And how can we make some of those systems work better, so that we're not also feeling like whatever we're doing isn't making a difference. So, here, take dates, please. Okay, dates. September 30th, October 1st and 2nd. It's an art of hosting learning retreat. It's 3 full days, non-residential, at Morton Arboretum in Lyle. And I have to say, at that time of year, it should be beautiful. We've been in the Morton Arboretum for spring. It's quite gorgeous. And fall should be equally beautiful. And we have Tim Mary coming, who's an amazing art of hosting global steward from Nova Scotia, who's worked a lot in healthcare and with city planners around youth and criminal justice, around many issues that impact, and finance, actually, finance. And he's also a poet and a musician. He's one of the people who's coming to host with us. And also Tuesday, Ryan Hart, who's from Columbus, Ohio, who's also equally amazing and has done a lot of work in healthcare and also with homelessness and a lot of issues around issues of social justice and power, dealing with around power and relationships. So they're hosting. I'm involved with it. Renee is involved with it. Kevin will be there. Christy, Janice, right? And a couple other people. We're apprenticing and learning here because we're growing our field in our community of practice in Chicago and in